In the next few weeks, maybe months, I'd like to visit some basic philosophical concepts because I think that's the level that the discourse needs to move to a certain extent. Now, lately I've been kind of in orbit around True Tom's YouTube channel and then the people that he's been interacting with, absolutism, generative anthropology, among other things, but that's just one area of interest for me. And, that involves concepts coming from postmodernism. And you have deconstruction, and this actually goes back really to Spengler and Nietzsche with Nietzschean perspectivism, and Spengler with this kind of like each culture represents a morphological type. And so any concept of truth, even philosophy within that culture, is really can't be extricated from its cultural context. And so you get this kind of cultural relativism intimated in Spengler. So the question of truth is really on my mind lately. And I got in an argument on Facebook. It was very civil, but somebody posted a link to some news outlet that was covering an article that was written in the 1850s or something by some Victorian era, English philosopher who was arguing that not having well-grounded belief, believing in things for which you don't have evidence, should be considered immoral. And it's easy to connect the dots in this argument. I mean, I've thought this sort of thing myself, where if you believe in things just because you feel like believing them, because you feel good about believing them, but you haven't done your due diligence, then you're likely to behave in ways that hazard those around you or cause, potential threats, harms. And, that makes sense. It did to me, and I can actually extend that further. I did when I was a little kid. I thought, people invest their time in watching television or playing games or doing various things when they could be learning more. And if having correct beliefs helps you to act in a moral way, then not learning as much as you can, not knowing as much truth as possible, could be seen as, in a sense, immoral. And considerations of moral utilitarianism often run into these sorts of problems where, well, if you want to maximize the good, then we are falling short in many ways all the time. And so this kind of utilitarian maximizing good concept results in us realizing we're really not adequate, which actually scares people away from that way of looking at things. But anyway, I did have a problem with this particular British argument. I think Clifford was the guy's name who made it, because the British empiricist school circumscribes truth to being something that's validated by empirical experience. And I think a lot of people maintain that, but in a fuzzy way, where they recognize that empiricism can't really prove itself, but its results have proved that it's capable, and empirical methodology is capable of doing what we've done, of discovering seeming principles of the universe. Of course, we can't really demonstrate that there is an external universe. We can just, prove, like Hume says, constant associations between data. But in any case, whether it is an external universe or whether we're corresponding with representations of causal processes in our models, or if causality itself isn't real, nonetheless, using empiricism experientially has resulted in technical applications. And that kind of appeal to the pragmatism of empiricism is a state that I can understand being in, and it's kind of where my head was when I went to college. And I ran into a guy who would be a friend throughout college. We discussed philosophy often. He was actually into Evola when I met him, And I hadn't heard of Evola at that point, really wasn't familiar with most of the Western philosophical canon. Just kind of had a interest in philosophical thinking myself. But anyway, where my head was, he was arguing for basically the absolute, arguing for this conception of divinity, and I was arguing against it, saying it doesn't correspond to experience. How can we prove it? That it's just funny. I was in exactly the state of mind, and that's kind of where the person is who I was arguing with on Facebook, where he seems to be. Now, is it adequate? It obviously, you're kind of begging the moral question. If to know what is true is a moral thing to do, because then you can, base your actions on truth instead of falsehood. If that's, right, then if we move to this pragmatic conception of good, then we say that the true is true because it works, which is predicated on a prior kind of evaluation of the good. And so then you get in an infinite loop of we justify our epistemology because it works, which appeals to ethics. And then we say, what is ethical is the thing that corresponds to some true principle of eudaimonia, or whatever it is that leads to positivity, whatever the conception of the good is in your epistemological framework, your scientific framework, philosophical framework, that informs your concept, your formal philosophical concept of ethics. And so in theory, you'd have this infinite loop going back and forth, justifying each other. But, my argument to him was that really, we have non-explicit, implicit, deep-seated dispositions of will that result in us selecting one kind of epistemic ethical loop over another. Of course, and this I didn't bring up because I tend not to overcomplicate, or I try not to overcomplicate arguments that I'm in, because you don't seem like you win if you just get everything down into the mud. But the problem with that is, if I assert that people choose epistemic ethical cycles that are ultimately kind of tautological, self-referential, then based on their disposition of will, then that's an assertion, and I'm saying that this is true, which, it just leaves you kind of in this ambiguous state, being unable to define the basic concept. And I've thought about this sort of thing in the context of my own philosophical framework, which involves, what perennialism involves, this kind of absolute simplicity that is identical with totality. So everything reduces to, is identical with this oneness. That's the Platonic concept of the one. And so, what is the good in that context? So I got thinking about that a bit more. And it kind of, let's go over some basic concepts of what the truth could be. One interpretation is correspondence between a statement, a proposition, and its referent. What it's pointing to. But that makes metaphysical assumptions that language is an act of representation, that there's something external to language that we're referring to, and that it's possible for that representation to be accurate or inaccurate. That kind of presupposes an external reality. Now, it doesn't necessarily presuppose that. You can have a correspondence theory of truth within an idealistic framework, and I kind of tend to entertain this sort of line of thinking, where there are multiple levels. I actually mentioned this in my discussion with Blithering Genius not too long ago. But if there are multiple types of model, if you're a composite kind of identity, then one level, the linguistic level of consciousness with one center, so there's an authorial subject of linguistic consciousness, and we can identify who the I is in language. That subject is one among many that makes up the total subjectivity of what we are, phenomenologically speaking. within the entire mental envelope. And so in that kind of multiple models, multiple systems within the personal identity, then you can say that, the linguistic syntax corresponds to something at some other level of mental syntax. Good afternoon, Tyrone. So, and that reminds me, I forgot on Saturday to show up, but I will this coming Saturday on Discord. The plan is 9:00 p.m. To do Discord hangouts, Eastern time. And then Jonathan Fay, the linguistic level only emerged recently with societies. Yeah, right. So that gets back to generative anthropology, which I've been considering lately. I have a book around here somewhere. This is the one that I chose to get. This is the first Gans book that I've decided to read, A New Way of Thinking. Haven't gotten too far into it. And this apparently is not particularly dense for generative anthropology. But I have read some blog entries, and I didn't want to start with on the origin of language because it became very expensive. I remember checking several months ago when Trudeau Tom first mentioned it, and it was cheap. It was like $10. And then I came back a couple weeks ago, and it had become much more expensive, which says to me that Trudeau Tom kept on referencing Gans, and then a bunch of people went out and bought that first book. That's my guess. But anyway, so yeah, this correspondence gets, we know what we're talking about if we're saying that there's one level of perceptual reality, like there's cognitive activity that is represented through a kind of syntax, an experiential syntax, which, that syntax has to do with our intuitions of causality, a sequence in time, a sequence of events in space. So, that kind of syntax of perceptual reality can map onto, there can be a correlation between linguistic sequences and perceptual sequences. And in that sense, the linguistic proposition could be true or false because it corresponds or not to perceptual syntax. But then obviously we say that we make mistakes in our perception as well. It's not just propositions that can be in error, but also our direct perception, our sight. So we can see a stick and think that it's a snake. And so what's the grounds for saying that that was a false perception? How come we can't say that that was true? Well, then, I would go to, there are levels of perception, or not perception quite yet. There are levels of awareness that are lower than perceptual awareness, where perception involves the application of these a priori intuitions of causality, time, space. But then there's also, the physical system that we idealize as material. We think of being made of atoms, but anyway, there's a real interconnected networks of physical systems that feed back on each other in terms of like affecting outcomes. So there's some level of awareness that could be built into systems generally of related systems. And so in that sense, there could be a failure to correspond between the perceptual level of awareness and then this more fundamental level of awareness, which may actually not be discrete in the sense that perceptual awareness is discrete. If perceptual awareness or consciousness is produced by the brain, which I think is a fair assumption, say maybe it's a holographic projection of some kind to account for the actual qualia, the experience of consciousness. That could be some kind of holographic factor, because holograms have the property that each part of a hologram contains the whole. The information of each part contains the whole of the hologram. That's the idea of it, which is kind of the quality of consciousness having a centrality, and yet, like, am I here or am I where I perceive? Because the mind is everywhere and yet has a center. So it has a oneness and yet a multiplicity. And that's the holographic quality of consciousness proper. But again, maybe there's this more fundamental level that all physical systems have. And then there's also holographic principles of non-biological systems, with the holographic principle in physics, saying that every region of space, the volume of it, is encoded in the surface area of that region. So if I draw a sphere right here, then all the information contained within the sphere is encoded somehow on the surface area. And so like three-dimensional reality is codable in two-dimensional terms. But anyway, getting back to the basic philosophical question, that could be a conception of the correspondence, but like this kind of meta model of correspondence, for that to be a way that the world is, we're making a different kind of truth claim. We're making a claim at a universal level where we say that, I mean, actually in this case, we're really making a kind of like a physical claim or a cosmological claim, a claim about the way that systems relate in general. There are also universal claims that we could be making about reality being this kind of reality as opposed to another kind of reality. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with correspondence. So like I invoke this notion that reality as a whole is infinite. Right? That's a basic question in my way of thinking. Now, the problem would be is if I say that reality is infinite as opposed to not infinite, then I'm saying reality is this particular kind of way. And once again, I refer to a correspondence between a reality out there and then, you know, my way of representing it. But that kind of correspondence couldn't be empirically validated. And so the linguistic proposition, we can't tell if it's going to correspond to, it can only not be contradicted by a perceptual syntax. And then beneath that, the actual interaction of the physical system, that also can't contradict the proposition. And so its truth value may just be unanswerable, in which case, I don't know how useful the correspondence concept would be. But anyway, correspondence still remains in the background there. Now, what I was thinking about just in the last day or two was if, you know, let's go back to my way of thinking. If reality is infinite, all states are produced necessarily as a result of this infinitude. So that would mean that all propositions end up referring to, corresponding to true states of affairs. If we limit a certain set of propositions and say that those propositions don't have true reference, then reality is limited by not being able to refer to that set of things out there. And so, because if we say that there's some general syntax to reality in its most basic sense, like basically I always go back to like the metalogical laws as being something that are just inescapable. They're always going to apply. We always have to take them into account in a model of the world. Well, if that's the case, obviously it's like this notion of the absolute infinite. How do you bridge that gap? Where do the metalogical laws come from? You still don't answer the question. Like the infinite is supposed to address the question of the origin of things. If there's this oneness, if everything is reducible to a simplicity, then you can explain the origin of complexity. But if with this pure infinity, you're automatically going to be restricted to the metalogical laws anyway, where does that come from? There has to be like this kind of, there are strictures on it that are just difficult to take account of. And I think classical theism can address this by saying that the infinite, the simplicity, existence itself, their conception of God, where do the metalogical laws come from? God doesn't so much create them as a separate thing, unless you're a nominalist. For traditional classical theists, you say that God's act of creation is at the same time the metalogical laws, which I can get, but then again I could say infinitude is the metalogical laws in all of their possible iterations. Which, okay, there's a conceptual argument that I could refer to here that's just occurring to me, where if I say, you know, what's my concept of the infinite? If it's an infinite set of infinite variability, that's occurring within some kind of linguistic substrate or a medium in which the concept of the infinite is intelligible. And for that medium to exist, there has to be kind of a law of the medium, or how does this infinite set of potentiality manifest? In order to think about the infinite as opposed to just pure nothingness, you're necessarily bringing in these metalogical laws. And so that's the sense in which I can relate my thinking of the relationship between one universal syntax and the unlimited being, the simplicity, to classical theism. So RJ, and I'll get back to this line of thinking and try to clarify it a little bit. RJ, the true is equivalent to the good, which is equivalent to being. How do you then justify a separation of what is known and what has existence? Well, yeah, I was talking about that. What is known, if we talk about something being known as a proposition or a model corresponding to a concrete referent, then that concept of knowledge, how is that separate from something existing? Because there are things that we don't know and yet have existence. I'm talking outside of my frame of reference. I'm not quite getting the thrust of, I think you're kind of like intimating some line of thinking here. But I do kind of buy that the true is equivalent to the good and equivalent to being, because if the simplicity is the thing to appeal to explain multiplicity, classical theists share this in common with me, with perennialists, then simplicity would have to be a maximum, not just a minimum. Now, I also kind of treat it as a minimum in that I say there's no inert matter, because what would that matter be composed of? It's at its most basic level, I say reality is holographic as well, just like consciousness, where every part would have to also be this maximal in itself. And that also, to me, like, is a necessity if you're to have the maximal infinity. If infinitude is to be maximal, then every part of infinity is also absolutely infinite. But anyway, so that's why I think that being itself and the true have to be equivalent, and anything taken away from being by something being temporarily absent is what we perceive as falsehood. So I've had this, that brings me to another way of thinking about truth that I've entertained, which is truth as privation, or rather falsehood as privation. Like there's privatio boni, where the evil is the privation of good. And so, like, from God's perspective, Eckhart says this, to God, and I don't know if it's elsewhere, probably it is in the Bible somewhere, but to God all things are good, to man only some things are good. So if you saw the totality of creation and saw all the karmic relationships within it, then you'd see how all of it amounts to a perfect representation of justice or beauty, or is as good as it could possibly be. Whereas when we're in the thick of it and we're living the suffering, then it seems bad. Of course, I also think there's a positive ontological status to suffering. Like, that's a real thing. You just have to say in this kind of transcendental way that it's, yes, suffering is real, but the evil of it is not. Because, and Platonic arguments fit in here where they say, Plato says that suffering is a way of paying for a line of action that wasn't good. So he reiterates karmic principles where suffering is kind of paying off bad conduct. But yeah, this, going back to RJ's point, can we justify a separation of existence as separate and the object of knowledge? So this would be like the signified conceptually and the referent ontologically. Like, what is the signifier pointing to outside of us intersubjectively, and then what does the signifier in language signify, which is the signified, which is the concept. That's one way of interpreting your question, and I'm not sure that these are fundamentally separate things, the signified and consciousness and the referent. Like, we're presupposing with the idea of a sign in the first place that it's like pointing us to something outside of ourselves. And this is the line of thinking about truth that I wanted to get back to. I kind of left it behind. But if reality is this infinite and all states using Schopenhauer's thinking, are states of will, and you will to be what you are in this moment. All moments have to exist. You exist now with all of your relationships to the past and present causal relationships. That's all part of this willing state to be what you are. In that sense, every willing state would be a possibility and make the truth of that state. And so in that sense, like the correlation or correspondence wouldn't be what's going on. It would be the will of this absolutely simple thing. Ultimately, when you get back to its source, the expression of will in a moment of experience would be the creation of the truth of it. So that would mean that, it's not a matter of perceiving an external existing reality with its own syntax. It would be your own will with its own syntax in it manifesting itself in your moment of experience now. That would be projected outward. It's not creating a model received passively from without. It's projecting model-like attributes, where within that, like the fact of correspondence would be something, a reality that's willed itself into creation, into existence. So it's a matter of like thinking of where the correspondence is situated. Is truth fundamentally correspondence, or is truth fundamentally a creative act? And this, again, I'm thinking in terms that postmodernists are thinking. When I was in that argument on Facebook, I got to think, like, I sound like a postmodernist right now. Now, I think it's healthy to entertain these sorts of things, but the objectivity of truth has been kind of obliterated in the last century. And so this is one way I can think of this, objectivity of truth not being the case. But even then, now I keep on going meta levels here because that's my method of thinking, but anyway, even then, if I say that truth is something that's willed and all truthful states are willed from this absolute simplicity in the perennialist worldview, then I'm saying still that like there is some reality that my propositional model there corresponds to. So again, I default back to, in asserting it, I default back to a correspondence. I'm going to read some comments, but it's difficult because perennialism and classical theism also ultimately resorts to mystery, that there are levels of metaphysics, the inner essence of things that we can't really get to. And I'm questioning now whether or not the act of reference itself isn't one of those things. Like, if consciousness is in some sense composed of reference, language is composed of reference, symbols referring to one another. If the act of reference is something that, in the same sense that God's creative act is identical with his essence in classical theism, the act of reference would be identical with the being referred to on either side, which in perennialism would be the same. Thou art that, the same on either side. All right. So Jonathan Fay, in order to perceive the whole universe, the sum of all things, we must separate from it, in which case we can be no thing. So the sum of all things must be perceived as nothing. Yeah. Again, like if you just use mystical language, I can get a feeling for it. Once you understand the philosophical system underlying perennialism, you can understand the Upanishads, you can understand Eckhart, you can understand Plato, you can understand all this stuff very easily. And simple mystical kind of expressions, stuff that you find in the Tao Te Ching, like that makes sense to you. But still, I end up like, I want to quibble over technical issues where I'm questioning even the formulation that's being put forward here. To perceive the whole universe as the sum of all things, sum of all entities, we must separate from it. That's if we are a subject separate from the world of all objects, then the universe, reality as a whole, we can't ever step outside of it. And so, like, even if we're nothing, as long as we act as a perceiver, it's still a thing there. And so I get that, like, if we contemplate the totality of it, we're reduced to nothing, or this simplicity, which nothing is falling on one side of a categorical ontological division, and so excludes like the infinite in its colloquial sense, nothing. So like rather than nothing, you would have to refer to the ineffable, the absolute, any number of these terms that refer to the ultimate reality that people refer to. And like that's another concept of truth. So that would be the truth, and everything else is merely an expression of it. And the expression may be more or less complete. Like that's what the Gnostics thought about reality. The Gnostics thought that, I don't know if all of them thought this, but I was reading the Nag Hammadi scriptures, and I forget which one it was in, but they were saying that reality is the name of God, which would mean that reality is a language, and it expresses a fundamental truth. So there would be an absolute referent. But again, if we're saying that it's not actually ontologically separate, like God expresses himself through an experience of world, but at all points, if you get into it, the divine is to be found there because it's omnipresent as well as omnipotent. Now, will truth, yeah, that feel when low IQ, well, I'll just move on. Orbit. So many difficult words. Yeah, Tyrone. Doesn't this all just come down to humans being unable to fully grasp reality? Yeah, because of the limits of our own biology/mental faculties. Well, that was another basic problem that I think people have to reconcile with, or acknowledge at the very least, that any purported truth about reality can't be distinguished from a truth about ourselves, because we're limited by our own mental faculties. And this is the origin of Kant's noumenon, because everything that we know is filtered through the forms of our perception. And so the only things that reach us are filtered by the anthropic principle. We're the kind of thing to experience the things that we encounter, not any old kind of thing. We're not an absolute generality. We have specific properties as mental creatures. So yeah, you can't really, like, the question of the scope of reality, no one is ever going to be able to disprove my assertion or my guess that reality fundamentally is unlimited. That's just kind of philosophically the way that I make sense of simplicity, by saying it's identical with the other kind of end of the infinite, not just without any borders and fundamentally simple in one place, but without any borders and fundamentally generative in all possible ways. And possibility even is an act of generation. So you get, like, I don't know. I still haven't dealt with the issue underlying nominalism. I think like Western civilization in general hasn't really dealt with nominalism properly. We're kind of like, Ivan covered in that video on the series by Gillespie, The Theological Origins of Modernity, like so much of our intellectual history over the last several hundred years has been just playing out the implications of nominalism. But anyway, any actual empirical experience or philosophical speculation won't be able to get around the fact that anything it looks at is within its own forms of perception and conception. And so beyond it is just untouchable and must be pure speculation. Will Truth. Our golden boy revolutionary Pat Little just got banned. I've never looked at Pat Little at all. Maldor. Reality is a creation of our own excesses. Well, yeah, I think you're an antinatalist, aren't you? But yeah, reality would be a creation of our own excesses in the perennialist view, which is why, like, I tend to attract antinatalists, because perennialism does imply antinatalism. It's just that I put it in its proper social context and say that the perfection of the human condition would be under the traditionalist kind of perennialism, where you're accepting ancient heuristics as valid epistemologically, not just this kind of like in classical theism, there's scriptural revelation, which you just take, and then there's philosophical justifications for it, which you can use reason to think about. Similarly, in my conception of perennialism, there's like philosophical perennialism, and then there are conceptions handed down, like the real perennial aspect, the traditional aspect of it. And so one of those traditional aspects of it is that the perfection of the human condition is separation from desire, is the path of the sannyasi, is asceticism to its extreme, which would be turning away from expression of will and turning to the source of will itself, which would be the place where you'd find the ultimate satisfaction of will, which makes a kind of mystic sense to me. And it's not like I haven't had these sorts of experiences back when I used to meditate and I was a little bit more disciplined overall. But I'm turning it around. I'm going to go back to being good. And so Ken says, and I haven't been looking at the chat adequately, but apparently I just got quiet. Yeah, I turned myself down somehow. Oh well. Yeah. So the audio should be better. And then Maldoror, when you mentioned in the video metaphysics and NPCs that infinity has no no's, does that also include the yes of no's? Yeah, the fact of no's. If I interpret you correctly, the fact of no's is present, but not an ontological fact of no's, only a perspectival fact of no's. So it's true that from my perspective, there are no bricks of gold in the room that I'm sitting in. That's a true no, but only relative to a particular perspective. The no doesn't get ontologized. But once again, you still run into this problem where if reality is the way that I'm talking about, where there's this absolute simplicity, which is existence, which is totality at the same time, that's kind of the distinction between classical theism and the perennialist view, like the Vedantic view, then you're still saying that reality is the kind of thing with no ontological limits, fundamentally. And that seems to present to the mind a kind of limitation, and that reality is the kind of thing that can't have, at the most basic level, no's in it. RJ, I think the answer to this question, the theosis of man, is found in the nature of God as necessarily both infinite and finite. How? And then theosis is the participation in the essence through the union with his energies. Now, again, I don't really get the philosophical justification for the essence-energy distinction in my discussion with Jay and in reading things that he wrote. I haven't done a bunch of research into orthodoxy because I just fundamentally don't understand why I should take it. And I thought, RJ, that you tended towards classical theism, but I guess you're orthodox. Maybe I just mixed that up. But yeah, I mean, if you presuppose that there is a distinction between essence and energy, any distinction is intelligible through a context, through a perspective. And so any real distinction that we know of, the only evidence of real distinction is through perspective. So I don't get the step of projecting it back onto the ultimate reality and saying the ultimate reality has to be of this kind of nature with this kind of distinction in it built in. But isn't that presumptuous? Like, how do we know? You'd have to just appeal to revelation. But then I get into, how do I ground my belief in a particular revelation? How do I know that that revelation is true? And if I can't do it, then I'm not just going to adopt it. Which, I don't know, truth really is interconnected with ethics. Epistemology is connected with ethics, because what compels me to seek a valid concept of truth, which is circular, is an ethical imperative that, my core ethical ideal is always seeking the truth and not just being satisfied with a system that works. Empiricism, science, is a system that works. It's not an ultimate conception of truth. And that's kind of what keeps me away from spending a lot of time invested in like research of orthodoxy, because how do I, it's a system that works, and Jay kind of appeals to this, like it's a coherent worldview. It works to explain the world. But then it's coherent in light of kind of prior intuitions and prior ethical values. But if I'm going to remain pure ethically in my conception, that I want always to break down to the fundamental justifications of a belief, not just that it's coherent, not just that it works. Because how do I know that coherence is enough? How does Jay know that a coherentist epistemology is adequate or the right one? All right, good, Tyrone, that you're on the forum. And he recommends that people join it. And I would too. I mean, we haven't really done much with it lately, but I do want to get back to it. If people start showing up on Saturday evenings at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time in the Discord that's linked there in the description, once a sufficient number of people start showing up to that, I know some people are not comfortable with Discord as an app, so we might look somewhere else eventually. But once we have a sufficient number of people, my idea would be to start building a chain of communications, whether that's like an email listserv or whether it's like more of a cell-based, like you contact this person, like a buddy system, you contact this person. Because I need a way, if we're going to keep the Academy thing going as an idea, we need a way of distributing that kind of any message, any change, any reminder of an obligation. We need a way of reaching out to people that's not relying on everyone converging on a central source, because an obscure website that we just made isn't really adequate for that. An app on the phone would be better, like if you got notifications from an app, great, but I don't know how to write an app. I mean, I could always try to learn, but that would probably take a while. Anyway, any other, particularly RJ, if you're still here, what's your interpretation of my hesitancy with regard to Orthodox theology and the essence-energy distinction? Like, how do I know that that's true apart from revelation? That's what I couldn't get out of Jay. Never could. He said it's necessary for a coherent worldview, but basically that, and there I see you posted, but yeah, basically Jay just kept on referring to it's necessary to integrate multiplicity with unity and to say how true multiplicity can exist. Because I think Jay's right in saying that classical theism leads to perennialism. I think he's right. And I can't understand why the classical theist stops in the act of creation and basically saying a certain set of things are true about the world and not everything else that could be true if God made an infinite creation. Like if God made a copy of himself, of the infinite, into the created world. I don't see where they get this particular kind of creation anyway. So orthodoxy is still something that I would like to consider. RJ, the good, the true being is and can only be finite. To attribute this to the infinite is inadmissible. But at the same time, God must be the good and the true, therefore he must be both. So, I mean, this isn't satisfying to me intuitively, and I'm not sure that I understand why you say it. Like, is not admissible, it's inadmissible on what basis? The good, the true, and being is and can only be finite. I don't get why being must be finite. In what sense is being finite? In itself, in its application. If you're going to say that there's a set of real things and a set of things that just aren't, although they can't really be a set, there can't be multiple of them if there's nothing there to produce the multiplicity because it's lacking being. But anyway, that's paradoxical. But being, if there's some things that are and things, or a set of nothing that isn't, of one nothing that isn't. I don't know. I can't intelligibly talk about it. That's why I always revert back to the perennialist interpretation of the infinite that makes sense to me. But what would that mean that being would be? Where does the finitude on being come from? Does the limit on being have being? So like did it circumscribe itself from the outset before existing? Or like, I don't know, it's just confusing. Or maybe he meant to type infinite. Not really true. Not really sure. Yeah. Profound Truth from Jonathan Fay. So I've kind of run out of steam here, but we talked about some stuff, and I'm not getting any new ideas coming out about the true. But I think, going back to the only new idea, the motivation for doing this stream today was that I've been thinking about truth in terms of generation. Like, we produce a truthhood, a creative act of our own, not just a receptive act, not just an act of describing a correspondence. And the correspondence could be situated, we could embed, correspondence is a thing, but it itself as a correspondent system of separate syntaxes between linguistic and perceptual and kind of physical syntax, that is as a totality generated from this unlimited source, the will in itself. And okay, so Rattle, is there an esoteric side of Christianity that goes into these topics at all? Something equivalent to Kabbalah and Judaism? Yeah, Gnosticism. Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is basically just like watered down Neoplatonism. So, look to Plotinus, look to who would be the best. There's one late antiquity Greek author. Can't think in particular of his name, but yeah, that would be probably the peak to look to there. Valentinius. Anyway, the Valentinian Gnostic system is the only one I'm really familiar with, but any of those systems are systems of myth. There's a set of symbols that work together to bring the mind to a state of gnosis, but gnosis isn't contained in the symbols. So like in the Valentinian Gnostic system, when they talk about the syzygies, all of that is analogical in some sense. All of that is a set of things for the mind to contemplate to allow the mind to return to its source, in my interpretation. Maldor again. The will present in all matter tends towards life in order to counter deprivation. This scheme I find to be inherently negative, deranged in process, intention, and execution. Yes, like perennialism does imply that. Schopenhauer implies and says the will is evil in like its acts. The will to power is evil. The will to anything is evil in a sense because it is negatively oriented. It's like, I want what I don't have. That's true of desire by definition. And so desire is kind of a bad thing. Nevertheless, though, in order to have an ontology that's not negative, in order to fill out creation and understand the fullness of truth and the fullness of goodness, you have to have this set of incomplete, desirous states. And the perfection of them would be escaping it. But it's still better, because the totality of the good is present in this case, for there to be this hierarchy of some beings being trapped by desire and some beings escaping it. And wishing it was otherwise is just kind of a desire, isn't it? It's an obsession. It's a state of mind that's not healthy. And so perennialist systems of religion and myth attempt to not like whine about how bad creation is. Maybe like Schopenhauer kind of does that a little bit. Not that much though. I think he overall has a good mentality, but authentic systems of perennialist religion like Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Gnostic Christianity rather like put us on a productive path into truth, into goodness, away from desire. But again, then you're kind of like ontologizing the absence, ontologizing the thing that is desired, and giving it reality, whereas the metaphysical claim of being infinite implies that that's like the distinction is somehow erroneous. So even in describing systems of myth and their function, and even in describing samsara and nirvana and the process out of them, we're still like generating a system of correspondences which themselves, like the perceptual field itself in perennialism, would be analogical, would be a linguistic system of reference back to a reality that can't, like none of these distinctions hold fast in the ultimate reality itself. Tyrone, yeah. And then Xander Caulfield, when did haplotype R1b turn to the dark side? Well, they came through the Caucasus into Ukraine. They came from the Maykop culture, and the Maykop culture probably came from the Leyla Tepe culture of modern-day Azerbaijan, and they were probably a mix of indigenous hunter-gatherers from that region, or rather like early agriculturalists. So you probably had some Basal Eurasian, probably some post Göbekli Tepe, early Neolithic agricultural Levantine Fertile Crescent population, but some of that, and also Iranian Neolithic. So these were, like the genetic studies imply, these were like darker people overall, but also people with a sophisticated technological background. The eastern side of the first Fertile Crescent, the Iran side, has been relatively sophisticated from early times, and there was even obsidian toolmaking in the Paleolithic, in the upper Paleolithic there. So R1b was present in that region as far back as the Mesolithic. So I don't know. I mean, as far as turning to the dark side, I think they had good aspects and had bad aspects. Like the R1a in Ukraine during the Mesolithic represents kind of the noble savage. No great level of technology, but kind of a blessed condition. They probably would have looked more aesthetic to us, the R1a population, mixed with I up there. And yeah, but not as sophisticated. Probably, maybe they had spiritual ideas, like the art at Mazin is advanced from 10,000 BC. That's where the swastika patterns come from in the first place. So R1a, maybe like this, and this would fit with the model where after the Middle Neipner culture, one day I intend to make a video on all the Indo-European stuff, but read David Anthony's book. It's kind of the definitive text, and so like you can't understand what's going on without it, or at least read Mallory. So, but yeah, after the Middle Dnieper culture, the R1a starts to become ascendant again. With the corded ware culture, R1a goes out, not just R1b, which was prior to that. Prior to that, the Yamna was dominated by R1b. That's the people from the Maykop, probably, or somewhere else, maybe Crimea. Advanced civilization people coming up into Ukraine and setting down this code of laws and bringing technology and really manipulating people. Like, that's a dark aspect, the technological mentality from R1b. And then R1a, they're the ones who were in charge when the Indo-Aryans came on the scene, and when what would become the philosophy I'm espousing here, Vedanta, when that originated, was under the influence of R1a in the Indo-European communities that migrated east, but also that migrated west. Like, I'm R1a, people in India are R1a, but so am I, and I went to Scandinavia. Obviously not personally, I'm talking my R1a lineage. So I'm just gonna, again, I intend to end soon, but I'm gonna read the rest of these. Wandering Lion, if we turn our will towards God, doesn't that solve the problem of the evilness of the will? I assume that God is absolute truth and goodness. Yes, that's the resolution. Of course, this would imply, the perennialist thing would be, rather than will of something separate, which always involves a negation, it's will of the ground of will. And so basically it's cessation of will, stopping the willing, that is what we're seeking here. Now you can think of it as willing God, but God is a transcendental signifier, so it's not really external. There's nothing you can point to that's like God. God is this like stopping all categorization. So that's a kind of a fine distinction. Not sure if that was totally clear. And then RJ, and in addition, the word infinite essentially does not reference its object because it cannot be referenced, like I was just saying. It references all finitude, which it negates. We do not even state that it exists. Well, the infinite would be existence itself. Like that divine simplicity from the classical theists' system, I apply as well, and perennialists apply as well. That Brahman is infinitely simple, is infinite, and but is fundamentally one. Yeah, will truth. Yeah, desires are bad, right? The more you desire, the more you want to desire in the future. Wandering Lion, in case you're not trolling, desires are probably the reason for all suffering. So if you think suffering is bad, then desires are bad. Yeah. And then Xander, sorry to get off topic. Thanks for the reply. I'm haplogroup G. Okay, so original Neolithic Europeans who also were present in the Caucasus. So R1b, like with their technical mindset, kind of messed up your population too. Overtook your population too. Same thing with mine. You were prominent in the early Neolithic, and then R1a dominated you, and my people, just in terms of the father's line, I'm sure we share plenty of ancestors beyond that, but in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, mine were dominated, and then we shook them off, and we ended up winning. Of course, now in the modern day, in European terms, R1b came back, and they're currently the ruling class. So, RJ, no, I don't believe it is correct to say that the infinite is existence itself. It is the ground of being, not being itself. Well, does the ground of being have being? Like, I don't know. I think this is the problem with like the way the Orthodox people think. They put too much stock in names. Like Jay acts like because he has a name for something, like, oh, there's essence and then there's energy, and there's these Greek words that correspond to these concepts. Just because you have a name doesn't mean you're actually explaining anything. All you're doing is building a system of intelligibility. But how do I know that that system is ontological and not just symbolic, not just there to aid your comprehension? And how do you know that God vouchsafed that direct revelation of the true distinctions in reality at the most fundamental level? You can't know that. Of course you don't know that. So anyway, that's the fundamental problem of truth. You can never know what's the truth that you have and what the truth would be beyond it. But of course, you immediately get into paradox and antinomy, because asserting that is asserting a truth. And can I be sure of that? So, I don't know. Sometimes I think we need a new kind of Cartesian revolution, a new kind of reduction back to a base level. Maybe postmodern thought was this process, and maybe soon we'll find a good basis for a truthful worldview, but maybe not too. We might just die. Anyway, thanks for listening, and show up on Saturday at the Discord, 9 o'clock p.m. Bye-bye.